Welcome to Face the Nation. I'm Leslie Stahl. Rumblings of a hostage deal. The Dukakis campaign worries about an October surprise. The Bush campaign fears the ghost of the Iran-Contra scandal. And the White House leaks a message it sent to Iran that no one is authorized to negotiate for the hostages.
They are in no way speaking with any authority whatever for the United States government. And I might say, as far as I'm concerned, I wish they would all just butt out.
An Israeli newspaper reported that the release of hostage Mittelschwar Singh was the payoff for a deal in which South Korea sold U.S. military spare parts to Iran.
This is completely groundless, I can say that.
Former Iranian President Bani Sadr fueled the rumors, charging that one-time intelligence agent Richard Lawless, who was in South Korea 2 weeks ago, was negotiating for the hostages on behalf of the Bush campaign, which called that a fantasy.
We haven't let up since they were taken. We're encouraged.
The Democrats dread an October surprise, just as the Republicans did in 1980.
They are making statements in Iran that might very well lead to a resolution of this problem in the future.
Mr. Bush, 10 days ago you accused the president of trying to manipulate events in the hostage crisis to meet his re-election timetable.
Then vice presidential candidate George Bush went on Face the Nation the Sunday before the election.
No, I don't think so now. I was thinking, of course, of Wisconsin. When the morning of the Wisconsin primary...
But you said that, events afterwards...
On the morning of the Wisconsin primary, the unprecedented press conference, 7 o'clock in the morning, to announce what was supposed to be good news.
If negotiations with Iran are not underway, should they be? We'll ask former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Carter's hostage negotiator Warren Christopher. And we'll talk about this year's campaign with political analysts Bob Beckel and Fred Barnes. The hostages, will they influence the campaign? An issue facing the nation.
From CBS News, Washington, Face the Nation, with CBS News National Affairs correspondent Leslie Stahl.
Joining us now from Connecticut, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and in Los Angeles, former Deputy Secretary of State in the Carter administration, Warren Christopher. Let's go to Los Angeles first. And Warren Christopher, you were very deeply involved in the Carter administration's attempts to get the American hostages out in 1980. I want to ask you about these recent rumors. Is it possible in your mind that third parties, without any authorization from the Reagan administration, are trying to make deals with Iran, or do you think the administration is in some way involved?
Well, Leslie, this is no business for amateurs or freelancers, but it seems to have a fascination for them. In 1980, we had a constant stream of private individuals coming to the State Department telling us that they knew how to solve the hostage crisis. We refused to have them go forward, but as I say, it has a fascination for them. Right now, I think the United States has a particular problem. One of the sad legacies of the Iran-Contra scandal is that the world may believe that we use private parties as General Secord was used. So I think we have to emphasize strongly that this is a government business, and I'm glad that Secretary Shultz did that last week.
Well, Henry Kissinger, do you read it as freelancers, or do you think that the administration is somehow orchestrating some kind of negotiation behind the scenes through these third parties?
I think it's possible that there are freelancers running loose, because I agree with Warren Christopher that it exercises a weird fascination on outsiders. I think fundamentally that the Iranian position is such that they will be releasing the hostages sometime over the next 6 months, and that they're debating in Tehran right now whether to release some of them for this administration or some of them for the newly elected administration. It doesn't require a very complicated negotiation. It seems to me, I think it would be a terrible mistake to negotiate even on part of the government, because we should not pay for hostages, since that only encourages the taking of more hostages. I think Iran has recognized that they have to open up to some Western nations, that they cannot do that while they hold these hostages, and that is our basic asset. And it requires no intermediary, and from the government it requires only a message that the hostages are an obstacle to any normalization.
Well, we've done that already. It's my understanding that we have sent many messages saying that we'd like to negotiate government to government or deal government to government, signals that we'd like to improve relations. We've done all of that and nothing's happened. How do you know?
Well, plenty has happened in Iran, not necessarily with respect to the United States. They've stopped the war with Iraq. They have improved relations with France. They have solved analogous problems with Britain. They have obviously divisions within their own country, and those have to be managed by their own domestic processes. When they took the hostages, both in the Carter administration and in the earlier part of the Reagan administration, their strategy was to humiliate the United States. And the more we negotiated, the more they made us look as if they could impose their will on us and demonstrate the impotence of the United States to protect its citizens and hence the people in the area. That condition has now changed. I think over the next 3 to 4 years, they will be looking to Western nations as a safety net, and it isn't in their interest to humiliate us, but it will go by fits and starts. And of course it will require some official statements and negotiations on our part to make clear that we are receptive to an improvement in relations, but I would pay nothing for the hostages.
Warren Christopher, do you think that it's a good move, as I gather we've already made, to seek to improve relations while the hostages are still being held?
Well, let me say this, Leslie, I wouldn't run after the Iranians. I don't have very many illusions about the present administration regime in Iran. The Ayatollah has such a strong anti-U.S. position. He's so unreliable, so untrustworthy, that frankly I'm quite skeptical about that. I think we may have to wait for a new regime. One thing I would say about Iran is that they have a great love to try to manipulate our elections. I saw that in 1980 and 1981, and they've shown that around the world, as in the French election. So I think the United States needs to be very skeptical, very wary of moves that Iran may try to make during this sensitive period. They like to play games in our elections, and we ought to be on the lookout for steps that they might take to mislead us or to get up our hopes in a false kind of way.
Well, you suggest...
I'm not in favor of running after Iran. I'm in fact opposed to talking about the hostages at all. I think the only message that Iran needs from us is that the hostages are an obstacle to an improvement of relations, and then see what they will do.
Well, what do you make of these messages that our government has sent, that we are willing to deal government to government, willing to talk government to government, a message sent while the hostages are still being held?
I have no objection to that at all, provided it is made clear that the actual dealing will not take place until the hostages are released. The only way to deal with hostages is to devalue them. That is to say, you cannot get anything for them.
Well, wait a minute. We've sent a message saying we'd like to have talks, government to government, the message sent while the hostages are still being held. That's where we stand right now, as I understand it.
I would be, the only conversation that I think it is worth having with the Iranians is to say that we have no national interest in keeping them down, that we are not opposed to them, that their independence is an American interest, but no concrete implementation of that conviction can be discussed until the hostages are released.
Okay.
And beyond that, I wouldn't go.
Warren Christopher, can I get back on the question of why there seems to be flurries of activities around elections? You suggest that it may be Iran trying to manipulate our political process, but what about what the various administrations do to encourage that or maybe even instigate it? All the stories during the 80 campaign, when you were involved, suggested that the Carter administration itself was taking kind of strenuous efforts to get the hostages home as the election was underway. And as you know, President Carter, was making optimistic assessments of the situation before every primary.
Leslie, our policy was no mystery in 1979 and 80 and 81. We wanted the hostages back the day after they were taken. We worked strenuously for that. So There's nothing, no mystery about what we wanted. We wanted them back any day we could get them back.
But didn't the activity heat up around the election? It certainly, as I recall, certainly did.
Well, I met with an Iranian in Germany on the 15th and 17th of September of 1980, but that was something that they initiated. Maybe they were manipulating us at that point, but we were ready any day to talk with them, and we finally got that opportunity in September. Of course, nothing happened until January.
Well, but did you not feel any special heat from the White House, the political side of the White House, to try and get this done before the election?
I didn't have to have any heat from any place. I had selected some of the people who went to Iran, and I almost became obsessed with getting them back, so nobody had to tell me to try harder.
Well, Dr. Kissinger, the last time a hostage was released, it was 1986, right before the congressional elections, right, when an American hostage was released, and we know that this administration was working overtime at that point. Why do you think it happens around elections?
Oh, I suppose that administrations welcome some good news just before elections. Speaking as an outsider and maybe as a professor, what I would really like to see is that when there are hostages, is that about 6 weeks before the election, we tell the hostage takers, we don't want to hear from you until after our election is over. The more importance we attach to hostages, the more likely they are to be taken. In this year, I don't really see which way the release of one or two hostages would cut, whether it would particularly benefit anybody.
Well, let me ask you both to comment on what our allies have done in Europe. The French dealt with the Iranians and improved diplomatic relations. Some say even in some way paid some ransom. Now the British are doing taking steps to improve relations, and there's word that their hostages are going to come out. Let me play devil's advocate and ask you, what's so wrong with that? Why not?
I think what the British are doing seems to me very appropriate. They have strictly separated the hostage question from other negotiations. The French got themselves into a position in which they actually turned over assets to the Iranians, and whatever they are saying, it looked as if they were paying ransom, and I don't think that's a healthy situation.
Leslie, I must say I don't agree with Dr. Kissinger on the 6-week interval. I think you have to keep pressing for the return of the hostages every day. I think that any notion that we would somehow not welcome them back during an election period is something that simply is not consistent with our desires to have them back whenever.
No, I'm not saying we wouldn't welcome them back. I'm saying we won't negotiate about them. They will release the hostages for their own purposes, as they took them for their own purposes. And of course they would always be welcomed, and of course it would always be noticed, and of course it would help relationship between the two countries. But they should not be able to inflict the indignity on us of making it look as if we were turning the return of Americans into a domestic political issue. Of course we take them back. Eagerly.
Warren Christopher?
Of course we'd take them back, and I agree with you, Henry, that the highest priority has to be given to making no concessions against the background of the Iran-Contra scandal. I think the United States will have a hard time rebuilding its credibility, that we don't make concessions. It may take some time for us to do that, and we have to stress that day in and day out.
Warren Christopher, are you advocating that we not even talk to the Iranians until Khomeini has passed from the scene and a new regime takes over?
No, I think we ought to talk with them. We shouldn't make concessions. We shouldn't pay ransom. I think we ought to be available to talk to them. I just don't have very high hopes. I wouldn't go way out of my way to try to court them. They're far too manipulative for us to deal with in this period.
I'd like to say one thing about the Iran-Contra thing. I think it has turned out that the assessment that President Reagan made, that there were elements in the Iranian government that were moving in a less aggressive direction, turned out to be correct. The implementation of that conviction became too exuberant and got into the wrong hands. But in fairness, one has to point out that the analysis turned out to be correct, and that the conditions that now exist on Iran, Iraq reflect, and also maybe on the hostages, reflect that the analysis was correct.
Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, Henry Kissinger in Connecticut and Warren Christopher in Los Angeles. When we come back, we'll talk politics with Beckel and Barnes.
I hope there will be other releases. I hope this is not just kind of a teaser, and then we'll see a long period before someone else is set free.
Joining us now, political analyst Bob Beckel and Fred Barnes, senior editor of The New Republic. Well, let's not argue who won the debate, but let me ask you, Fred, first. If you think that Quayle's performance was so unsettling that it will affect the way people vote, will move people either from Bush to Dukakis or from Bush to undecided?
I don't think it's going to move very many people, but I think it did solidify the Quayle factor in this race. I think it's going to be a small factor. I mean, these guys are running for vice president, not president, and that's what people mainly vote for. But Quayle is going to be a small drag on the ticket. The good news for the Bush people is that there's a month before the election. And there are a lot of things that are going to happen. There's going to be another debate. There will be other issues. There will be many more ads on television that will tend to take the public's attention away from Quayle.
But do you agree that right at this point, that debate had the effect of making people say, wait a minute, I better rethink this?
Not many.
What do you think, Bob?
As usual, I don't agree with Barnes on this at all. I think it froze the election. I think it was the single biggest event of the fall so far. It brought Dukakis back into the race. The other thing about it is it's not a question of what Fred and a lot of other people, conservatives, think is that people aren't going to go out and vote for the vice president, for or against Quayle. That may be true, but the big question here is, what does Quayle mean, the selection of Quayle, for George Bush's judgment? And I don't think there's any question but that this thing's going to impact on Bush extremely negatively.
You know, Fred, when Ronald Reagan came out and started to defend Quayle, I began to think the Republicans must be very worried to bring out their ultimate weapon on this.
Well, of course they're worried. They don't want him to be more than, say, a 1-point drag. They don't want him to be a 3 or 4-point drag in a very close race where they could lose. But the thing about Quayle is, where is he going to take the votes away? Is he going to deprive Bush of his base in the South and the Plains and the Rocky Mountains? I don't think so. Maybe he'll hurt in Pennsylvania. Maybe he'll hurt in Maryland, and maybe Bush won't win those states. But those are Dukakis' base. And so I don't think they're going to drive many people away from Bush, and practically none, actually.
What about that?
I think we're talking here about a 3 or 4 point shift in this electorate, and that could make the difference. And when you start talking about Pennsylvania and Illinois and Ohio and states where I really do think it makes a difference among undecided voters, it's probably not going to change any votes in the Republican base, the Democratic base, but that's not where you win these elections. You win them among undecided voters, independent voters, and those are the people we're seeing in the polls are having the biggest problem with Dan Quayle.
Yeah, but Bob, those states are the Democratic base. Mike Dukakis
Ohio and Illinois are the Democratic base?
Look, the way Mike Dukakis is beset in the Electoral College now, he has to win every one of those states. He's not going to win any of the South. He's not going to win the Plains. He's not going to win the Rockies. I don't think he's going to win a single state in the South. He's behind by 20 points in most of them: Florida, Virginia, South Carolina, Alabama. And so he's going to lose all that. He has to win every one of those states: Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. He has to win all of them.
No, he doesn't.
California, Oregon, Washington.
Texas?
He doesn't have to win.
He's already lost Texas.
You don't think this helps?
Actually, having Benson on the ticket as a senatorial candidate has probably hurt Mike Dukakis in Texas, because voters there can say, gee, I'm happy to vote for Benson for the Senate, and I can vote for George Bush, another Texan, for president.
It hurt him in Texas? Fred, where were you late last night, pal? This is the one thing Dukakis has got going for him, obviously, in Texas, is Benson. The polls show that it's closing, not widening. The issue about the South, though, I think one thing you can say about it is you're right, that the South, pretty much, the old Cotton South, is coming back solidly for the Republicans. There are some possibilities for Dukakis in the South. I think Georgia's still a possibility, Arkansas, and maybe Kentucky, and Texas. But I think those are the states you're talking about.
I want to ask you both, what, first, Bob, you think Dukakis must do now, if there is any advantage to be taken out of this weak performance by Quayle? What does Dukakis have to do now?
Well, he's got the biggest moment of his career coming up here on Thursday or Friday night in the debate. And I think what he's got to do is drive the nail on Dan Quayle home, and he's got to drive it around George Bush's judgment. That's one. Secondly, I think he's going to have to get back and try to push Bush off as the elitist candidate, which he's not been very successful at doing. And the other thing Dukakis has got to do is stop waiting to go on the attack. As soon as George Bush raises his head, he's going to have to take a shot.
You don't think the Quayle bashing is going to get awfully tired?
No, I don't think it's going to get tiring at all. I don't think it's... Listen, is Willie Horton getting tiring? No, not for the Republicans.
Yeah, but there's a difference. Willie Horton says something directly about Mike Dukakis. Dan Quayle's...
Dan Quayle doesn't?
I don't think you can use that judgment issue. You can say Dan Quayle's not so hot, but people are going to choose on the basis of George Bush.
You don't think it can become a judgment question? No, why not?
Well, because they've tried that for a long time and it hasn't worked, and I don't think it is going to work.
You don't think it can work after that debate?
I don't think it can work after that debate. I don't think it'll probably work after maybe today or tomorrow. But look, here's what Dukakis has to do, and Bob's partly right. but he's got to get an issue and stick with a real issue, not Dan Quayle, perhaps the economic issue. He's flip-flopped from issue to issue, day after day, and people don't know where he stands, who he is, what he's campaigning as. He does need to get on the attack. There's no question about that. He needs to attack Bush relentlessly and try to reinvent the wimp, show this guy's indecisive and so on. And lastly, and this is very important, he has to show some warmth, some personality, some charm.
What is the overriding theme for Dukakis, a positive theme? What is his one message that's clear that people can understand?
Well, I think he's been around it on this middle-class squeeze issue stuff, but he hasn't quite gotten his finger on it. The problem is that he's been constantly on the defensive on these attacks on George Bush. And incidentally, yesterday, when he took Bush on crime, it was about time. It was a very good response. George Bush talking about crime, and sounding tough on crime is like Truman Capote trying to sound like John Wayne. I mean, it doesn't mix.
I need to ask Fred, though. I mean, there's been a lot of talk that Dukakis doesn't have a theme, a message, but what's Bush's?
Well, Bush's theme is peace and prosperity. You
That's
liked it
a
under
slogan.
Reagan? That's a slogan, but that's all you need. Look, you can say, Reagan brought you all this, and I'll continue it. I'm Reagan's heir. That's enough for him. But Dukakis hasn't given you a big reason why he should be elected.
Against the peace and prosperity. Are you, either of you, worried about your man's being perceived as too negative? I mean, they're both bashing each other. As somebody who's been watching the ads myself, you get turned off. People aren't going to go vote.
Well, it may impact in the voting booth and turnout. That's quite right, and if it does, it probably has a marginal impact on Democrats. But let's face it, this election so far has not been one you'd want to put in the civics book for future generations to look at as a model presidential race. But George Bush has based his entire campaign, underlying the peace and prosperity, but it's been entirely based on a negative campaign, and it's the old classic Republican attack on the left.
But Bob, if Dukakis has to come off as more likable in this debate, how's he going to do that if he also has to attack George Bush?
That's the ultimate balancing act, and the most difficult thing Mike Dukakis has got.
Does a smile when he does it?
Well, no, I mean, I think Lloyd Bentsen smiled when he hit Dan Quayle. That worked. But I think that
no, our poll said that as many people felt that it was offensive as thought it was a good shot at it.
That was probably right after the debate. I bet they don't now. I bet they think it was probably a pretty good shot now.
Well, what about George Bush? He too has that same problem, doesn't he? Staying negative, but
he doesn't have to stay as negative as he was before, because he has already made his overriding point, and that is that Mike Dukakis is a liberal. And he just has to remind voters occasionally in the last month about that. And so he's free to go more positive, to talk about peace and prosperity, and most important, make no mistakes. He's ahead, make no mistakes.
Speaking of mistakes, how could Dukakis deliver his foreign ownership message at a plant owned by the Italians? How did this happen?
You got me, but that's the advantage. I managed the last campaign, so I can't complain about this.
You can't slide off that.
No, listen, I think the message is terrific, but this is a kind of mistake that it happens in presidential campaigns. It was too bad because it stepped all over the message, which I think was quite a very good message all the way around.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Sorry. I could go on forever. Thank you both, Bob Beckel, Fred Barnes. We'll be right back. That's our broadcast. Thank you for joining us. I'm Leslie Stahl. Have a good week.
Face the Nation with CBS News National Affairs correspondent Leslie Stahl was produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guests and topic. This broadcast originated in Washington, D.C.